Hi, my name is Lauren. I'm the technical trainer for Genesis Attachments. In today's video, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk to you guys about the greasing practices for your Genesis work tools. This particular model standing next to me is a GXP 1000. Although GXT models, as well as many of the demolition work tools, are going to be very similar in regards to grease. In my hand here, I'm holding a Genesis branded Extreme Pressure EP number 2 lithium. I want to make sure that you guys are aware that you do not use moly grease on these shears. It's EP number 2 lithium based grease only. As it pertains to the front side of this shear, the front half, the work half if you will, there are a number of different grease points. There is an end cap grease point on both sides of the shear. These should be greased until you see grease extrusion from between the upper jaw and the wrap area, as well as the auto guide puck. The auto guide puck on XT models is greased from the outside, but on the XPs you actually have to reach inside and grease it from between the upper jaw and the wrap area. The jaw can be closed when you do that, but you need to smear grease along that riding surface on the upper jaw. The upper cylinder pin, which we can't see in this video because the jaw is open, is greased from the opposite side. That's perhaps the area on the shear that requires the most grease because it's the point of articulation that moves the furthest on every stroke. So after you have both end caps, your auto guide, and your upper cylinder pin greased, you can move to the back side of the shear. But before we do that, basically any operation of greasing that has to do with cutting should be done every 4 hours. If you're in extreme conditions such as extreme heat, or perhaps in a really abrasive environment with concrete or perhaps some type of mill slag or near the shear's maximum appetite, you may want to shorten that interval up. The 4-hour grease interval for these points also includes the rear cylinder pin, which of course if this were mounted on a carrier would be up in the air, typically fairly easy to access. That grease point may be on both sides of the shear or through one end of the rear cylinder pin depending on the shear model. Now we'll move to the back half of the shear. Now back here on the back half of the shear, or the upper end depending on how you look at it, we have the rotation assembly. Now depending on whether or not you have a rotating shear or a straight shear, you may have a similar arrangement, or it could be perhaps a long reach or travel type transport bracket. So there's a lot of variety and arrangements that you can see back here. But for the most part, the bracket can be greased in a similar manner. There's a grease fitting on the top of the boom pivot, which greases this pin and this area of articulation, which is where the entire shear assembly pivots on the carrier. And then you also have the cylinder pin, which controls the movement of the shear in and out from the carrier. So that one is typically greased through the rod end or the clevis of the cylinder on the carrier. And this one is greased through a grease port on the top side of the bracket. Now some of these shears, people tend to hang hoses or use devices for assistance when they're greasing hard to reach areas. So if you do that, you want to make sure that your grease connections are tight, they fit, and they don't leak. You want to make sure for proper grease extrusion around the pivot or the pin, the area that you're greasing, and making sure that the grease isn't escaping somewhere else where you can't see it. As it pertains to the ring and pinion gear, which is inside this bearing assembly, there is a ring and then there's a pinion on the output of the gearbox or the motor. That's greased through this port. When you grease either the bearing or the pinion, in order to make sure that that pinion is actually getting greased, you have to grease the shear and rotate it. If you don't rotate it, there's no guarantee that the grease that's going into that ring gear compartment is actually making it all the way to the pinion, which can ultimately lead to gear wear. The slewing ring has 4 grease fittings on it, and these can be greased at any of these locations. It's best to do it while the shear is rotating if you can, but oftentimes that, well, in almost all cases, that would require 2 people to be doing the greasing process. Otherwise, if that's not an option, you can grease each one of these ports, perhaps with 4 or 5 pumps, and you should be able to see the grease extrusion from between the bearing halves where the dust seal is. And then you'll want to make sure to rotate the shear. Not only are you lubricating the bearings here, but then you're also making sure that the ring gear on the inside, the grease is making it up to the pinion. This rear cylinder pin back here that I mentioned earlier is one of those 4-hour interval grease points. Everything else back here is a grease point of interval of every 8 hours or every shift, basically. Again, if you're in an extreme condition, perhaps you're doing a lot of movement, a lot of articulation for hours on end, you may want to shorten that interval. You also want to use premium EP number 2 lithium grease on the bracket components. If you have questions on any of these grease practices, you can reference your owner's manual, which is also available at genesisattachments.com, or you can call the Genesis Service Department at 888-SHEAR-IT. Thank you.